So the federal assault on higher education has escalated exponentially this year, and the damage is already being felt. And recently, I spoke with Dr. Zakiya Ellis, a principal at the Education Council, and also the former Secretary of Higher Education for the state of New Jersey, and also senior policy advisor to the governor there. And she's one of the sharpest minds working on education equity today. And we talked about what disappears when diversity, equity, and inclusion disappears, and who bears the burden when research funding is threatened or gutted, and also what the fight for an inclusive higher education is going to be costing the next generation. Here's our conversation.
With your background, it's really a pleasure to speak with you today. And I did a reel a while back on diversity, equity, inclusion. That I thought it was important that whenever we talked about it, we speak about it in whole words.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
Because people say, DEI, and even folks that would line up in causes that we agree with, or line up on what I believe to be the right side of history, they make the mistake of using the term DEI hire as an insult. And it's like, no, you don't get it. You're missing the point of this.
Yeah,
It really
yeah.
frustrates me. But with respect to education and higher education, on the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what is it that disappears when DEI disappears?
Yeah. So I appreciate the diversity, equity, inclusion. I think it's helpful to kind of actually say what those words mean because words do have meaning. And in this era, sometimes when you truncate it, people say, "What is DEI?" Well, I'm not really sure what that is. So diversity, the idea that multiple perspectives are good for learning and for helping
Right.
us work and getting, if you have all the same kinds of people together, that you're actually not being excellent. That's really this idea that diversity is somehow at odds with excellence is a total farce. So the
Mhm.
first thing I would say is what you lose is a sense of excellence in whatever you're doing, an excellence in your education because you've now watered it down because you're only getting some people at the table or some people in your classrooms or some people on your campuses. Diversity is the idea that you want to bring talent from wherever it may be. And I think if you've ever been around a group of people that's outside of your own bubble, you see that there are really talented, smart people from all over. And so the idea that you want to bring all of that to college and universities in this instance is one, and you are missing that if you are getting rid of some of these initiatives. And we've seen how that can play out. The other thing is equity, and that is just making sure everybody has what they need to be successful. And so we've seen things like, I've seen like, programs for women in STEM cut. And it's like, why are we cutting programs to help women do well in science and giving support for students? We're seeing things like there was a Black student newspaper at the University of Alabama, and they said that's at odds with our DEI, anti-DEI stuff. And it's like, why can't we have a newspaper that's about celebrating and not even just celebrating, but reporting on Black issues? It doesn't mean that you can't read the newspaper if you're not Black. So it's like, what is going on here? And inclusion is actually this idea that you want to make various people feel welcome. You want to have spaces that are inclusive of all different types of perspectives. And so I think these things go together, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was a sense of progress that we were doing these things when you think about college and universities when they first started. And even as late as like the 60s, you can't really see my shirt, but my alma mater, Vanderbilt University, didn't even allow women or
Uh,
Black people until, almost the 70s. And there are a lot of American institutions of higher education that were like that. And that is not excellent. That is not being inclusive for sure. And so this idea of creating spaces where that can be the case is being lost right now.
you were a Secretary of Higher Education in New Jersey, and you've seen, what inclusive higher education actually produces in people's lives. Regarding the wider lasting impact of the current attacks on higher education, what do you believe is the generational impact of these attacks?
I'm so thankful that you asked this, and I did when I was in New Jersey. You have diverse, institutions, and then one of the most diverse states in the nation. So people from all different countries, different types of languages spoken, racial, ethnicity, diversity. People think of New Jersey as just close to New York, but it has a great diversity of of kind of rural areas, and then certainly more urban areas. I happen to live in a place that was like cornfields and horse farms, so very beautiful. So you kind of got all those different perspectives, and that was reflected in higher education. So you had some that like catered to uh, agriculture, some that catered to media in the New York, ecosystem, and that was great to be able to see. The lasting impact, though, of what we're seeing now being torn down, I think, is there's a certain worldview that if you don't score X on a standardized test, that your contribution is not valuable to higher education. And we know that's not true. Even the people that make the tests will tell you that that's not true, that it's not like if you just get people that score the highest number on the SAT or ACT and get them together, that you're going to have excellence. They will say, no, that's actually a misuse of our tests. And so I think one thing that we're seeing is potentially a generation of talent that is not included in our institutions of higher learning. To be clear, you don't have to go to college, obviously, to contribute to learning in this country and to contribute to the fabric of our democracy in lasting ways. But there is something special about, I think, colleges, which are meant to be a place where people of differences come together, debate ideas and test them, and produce new knowledge for the world, research. And so we're going to see a generation of kind of research that is maybe lessened because it doesn't include the kinds of perspectives that we want. And I actually worry that the course of our history and the way we talk about history and whose stories are included, that shapes how we think about our nation and takes a long time, and not just our nation, but the world. That
Yeah.
takes a long time to undo. And I worry that that's actually the point, is to change the way we think about
Yeah.
what is true, what matters, whose stories matter in a way that just changes the kind of trajectory. Again, we've just now gotten to the point where we're saying, oh, you know what? Back in the 1600s, it wasn't just the Mayflower as the story. There are other people whose stories were there and that maybe we weren't lifting up, and maybe we should do that. I worry that we're going to be doing a lot of undoing. It's going to take a lot to undo where we've gotten to now.
It seems like it's just in terms of building strength from the inside out. Like I always praise my kids. I praise them for how hard they work, never for how smart they are,
Yeah.
because that's the more valuable lesson. But in terms of fighting back, right? We've seen some institutions, respectfully decline the play for pay, actually, really of this administration, in terms of getting access to educational funds that were actually, granted to them already.
Yeah.
What separates the institutions that are successfully pushing back from those that are capitulating? And I'm curious about, some of the smaller, less resourced
Yeah.
schools, that don't have Harvard's leverage and don't have the endowments of Yale.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this so much over the past couple of weeks. There have been some big education conferences and higher education. And so you go and you hear people. I recently heard David Pressman, who's former ambassador to Hungary under the previous the Biden administration, and he saw um, uh, the Hungarian institutions of higher education kind of cave under their autocracy.
Hmm.
And now they are basically wholly owned subsidiaries of the government, and they do what the government says. And I don't know if you've ever read, I had a great English literature teacher in high school, and she had us read George Orwell's books. And so we read like
Hmm.
1984 and Animal Farm. If anyone
Hmm.
hasn't read them, they're really interesting, and they're
They
a lot of
should. They
parallels
should
to
read them.
what's going
Yes.
on today. But the idea that the government tells you what to think, and the government says what you can and cannot say, and there's certain words that you cannot say, and that's what the government is telling you to do, and that's kind of the worst case scenario, as I see it, is like institutions are that way. And so I
Hmm.
think having a perspective that uh, once you start to um, once you start to compromise your values, it's not just kind of a little bit, it's like being a little bit pregnant. And so it's kind of like you either have these values and you stand for them or you don't, but you can kind of justify them. And David kind of gave an example of when you're these institutions in Hungary would say, well, I'm really trying to do this because I'm trying to protect my students. I'm trying to protect the research dollars. And if I don't make these compromises, think of them and think of the people that work on the grounds, and they won't get paid if I don't make these compromises.
Right.
And those things may be true. And what kind of country do we have? What kind of universities do we have if they are owned by the government, if they are doing what the government says to do in terms of the kinds of research that they can carry out, or the kinds of words they can say, or the kinds of professors they have on campus, or the student body that they have, if that is directed by the government. And you
Right.
may think that there's actually a conservative thinker and writer who wrote about, well, what if there was a president AOC and a Secretary of Education, Rachel Maddow, who, I'm like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, let's think about that. But isn't it just as bad if they say, you know what, this is how you have to do diversity in this very specific way, and you have to have this percentage of students from this race, and you have to talk about history in exactly that way. That would be equally as bad. We don't want the government telling us exactly how. There's a beauty in independence, especially in research and thinking, that I think we're missing. So that I know every institution doesn't have the resources of Harvard, but we're actually seeing institutions of great resource kind of, I think, play footsie with these ideas instead of saying, no, we actually don't think it's acceptable for the government to dictate these kinds of things. There is a certain responsibility, sure, that research institutions, or all institutions, have to serve the public. And I think it would be a great idea for institutions on their own to say, this is what we stand for. This is how we are. In certain ways, they haven't always lived up to that public service. They haven't always been as inclusive. They haven't always focused as much on student success. So yes, like, think about those things, but have a hard line in the sand about whether or not the government can extort money from you that you already were due. That feels like a principled stance that I think it's just one that we have to be able to take. And it feels like it's easy if you're not a college president to say, but we do have some that are taking that stance. And I think that's useful and valuable.
Finally, I was speaking to some members of Congress about the brain drain, the competitiveness of America that is vested in our institutions. And one of the things that you brought up was the crisis of research funding.
Yeah.
And I was curious, in your words, who bears the greatest burden when that kind of funding is taken away, and what happens to the pipeline of students who are trained to do that research that requires or that is dependent upon that federal funding?
The research piece is just so huge because I don't know if people realize, they think of, colleges as a place where people go and learn, but
Yeah.
so much of our kind of research that undergirds our technological advances, our scientific advances, our even our humanitarian advances. There's like humanities research that's done. So humanities are like, the English and philosophy um,
The liberal
and
arts. Yeah.
yeah, the liberal arts, those help us think about the world, not just to kind of in the material STEM ways, but kind of again, that's the place of where you kind of whose stories are told. And sometimes that research, and particularly in recent years, there were more opportunities for that research to be more inclusive and be more thoughtful of not just, no offense, old dead white guys that had thoughts in that way, but there are other great thinkers in our past that we can learn from, and let's bring in those perspectives. And how do we think, again, that diversity that strengthens our thinking, actually. I think that's at risk when not just, I think that is at risk because of the funding taken away. And I want to say a point about this because
Hmm.
lately some folks have been saying, well, the funding was actually restored, and it was. So after some of it, not all of it,
Hmm.
after going back and forth with Congress and a lot of advocacy, and maybe folks like yourselves, like hearing from people saying, hey, whoa, don't take away this research funding, Congress did not go along with the president's proposal to strip research funding completely from these institutions. That
Good.
said, there's still conditions on the funding that is out there that
Hmm.
has changed the nature of how people think about it. And I've actually seen research on this. Even if there's not the explicit, you can or cannot say this, we've already kind of turned a tide where people are like, if I use the word diversity, let's say it's not even about race, like, because I think sometimes people hear diversity, they think race. Just going back to like, there's different kinds of flowers, and a florist or somebody that's studying like
Yeah.
agriculture may describe the diversity of flowers, right? In their research, they're like, I don't want to get flagged by your AI diversity reader, so I'm taking that out. That's stupid. That's just stupid, okay? Like, so we've got people who are really smart people spending time doing stuff like that. that changes the nature of what it is that they are doing, even if the law hasn't actually said there's less money. And so I want us to just realize that there's some kind of self-censorship that's happening, that when you read kind of some of those Orwellian books, that's the key. Like if you can get people to censor themselves without you having to do it, you've changed the trajectory of things forever. And I worry that that is a place where we are, even if the line amounts are unchanged. And so that takes some cultural backbone to say we still care about these concepts as part of how we think about the world.
Yeah, there's that chilling effect, right?
Yes.
You were that self-censorship, which is more effective than any other kind. And there are plenty of endowments overseas and other places, other countries that maybe don't have those strings attached. And they say, hey, come here. And the funny thing about people who are students, for instance, who are attracted to research, they tend to figure things out, and they can see what's happening. And if they have the opportunity to do a study in their preferred field with strings attached or not, they have a decision to make. And I think that contributes to that potential brain drain that we may see leaving America.
You could see that already, the trends of where people are coming to study. And I actually
Okay.
think that's a feature, not a bug of these policies. The current folks have said, we don't want international students. We don't want people from other countries. We don't think they have as much to add. And so that's a real loss for us in the long term.
Now we're going back to the point about diversity. Well, what a pleasure it was speaking with you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really good to dig into this.